So the master gland is the pituitary. So this is up in the brain. And it's called the master gland because it secretes a wide variety of hormones that signal to all of the other endocrine glands in the body to help control homeostasis. That's really the big overall job of the endocrine system, is to regulate homeostasis across the body. And you've learned in anatomy and physiology about all the different hormones that are secreted by the pituitary and their different effects, and we'll go over that a little bit more going forward. But I just want to point out the important pieces. So the hypothalamus is a part of the brain, sits right above the pituitary, and it communicates with the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is one of the most primitive portions of the brain. It controls our sleep-wake cycles. It controls appetite. It controls temperature. It controls all of these other, the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland then secretes a bunch of different hormones that can have other effects, such as the thyroid. So thyroid-stimulating hormone is secreted by the pituitary. The adrenal gland, adrenocorticotropin hormone, is secreted by the pituitary to affect the adrenal gland. We have the pancreas. That actually is not under the control directly of the pituitary gland, but indirectly through growth hormone, which can stimulate insulin-like growth hormone that participates in all of the metabolism of the body. The ovaries are part of the endocrine system, and in males, the testes. So we have follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that control the production and secretion of estrogen and testosterone. So that's just an overview. And I want to remind you of the classes of signaling molecules. So hormones can be divided into endocrine and exocrine. What's the difference between endocrine and exocrine?
Blood and ducts.
What's that? What are in ducts? Which ones?
Endocrine are in the ducts and the exocrine is in the blood.
Other way around. Yep. So endocrine are secreted into the blood. And so they signal through the bloodstream. They're secreted by a gland in one area, travels through the blood, and binds to receptors on a gland in another area of the body. So that's endocrine signals. Exocrine signals travel in ducts. So they're secreted into a duct, and then that duct carries that signal to where it's needed. So it's physically separated from the blood. And the example that is most easy to wrap your head around is the pancreas. So yes, Alex.
So a quick question, as far as the endocrine, is that only limited to hormones while exocrine is only limited to other fluids, or is it interchangeable?
So the terminology can be a little bit confusing. Some people only use hormone to refer to endocrine signals that travel in the blood. Other people refer to hormone as any cell-to-cell communication that has to travel some distance. Does that make sense? So it could be either, is the basic answer. Most of the time, endocrine signaling is synonymous with hormonal. And then exocrine can be a variety of different things. In the pancreas, exocrine signals are mostly your digestive enzymes. So your hormones, your endocrine signals, are produced, insulin and glucagon are the primary ones, by some cells in the pancreas. Other cells, the acinar cells in the pancreas, secrete lipase, and a bunch of your other digestive enzymes. I'm just going to close the door really quick. I like the music, but. So these acinar cells, they secrete digestive enzymes directly into the ducts, along with fluid, and then that fluid with the enzymes travels through those ducts into the small intestine, where it performs its action. Insulin and glucagon are secreted into the bloodstream. So you can see here, what they're showing is that these cells are surrounded by a capillary network, and these hormones go directly into the blood, where they're then carried away to the rest of the body. And then a different way of classifying signals is by how they act. So they could be paracrine, autocrine, and then that's usually, distinct from endocrine. So paracrine signaling means that they signal the neighboring cells, whereas autocrine means they self-stimulate. So there's another type of cell in the pancreas called the delta cells that secrete somatostatin, and somatostatin signals to the alpha and the beta cells and inhibits their release of hormones. So in that case, it doesn't actually travel through the blood. It doesn't travel through a duct. It acts very locally. So that's a paracrine signal. Insulin, when secreted by the beta cells in the pancreas, gets into the blood, but some of it actually can stimulate the alpha cells to inhibit glucagon. So insulin can act both as an endocrine signal by traveling through the blood and as a paracrine signal by signaling to its neighbor. So there's just different ways of talking about the action of different signaling molecules. So endocrine really means it's traveling a distance through the blood. So its effector cell is somewhere remote from the cell of origin. So, quick test. Take a minute to read this question. Confer with your neighbor. All right. So what kind of signaling molecule is Sonic the Hedgehog? Paracrine, right? So you don't have to know anything about Sonic Hedgehog. You don't have to know anything about development or neuroscience to be able to figure out the answer to this question. So that's one really important skill in the sciences, is to be able to extract what is important to figure out a problem versus all the other extraneous information. And I love neuroscientists because they come up with really cool names. So hedgehog was actually first discovered in Drosophila, and then when they found the mammalian form in rodents, they called it Sonic hedgehog to kind of step it up a bit. But it's actually a really important signaling molecule. Good, so you guys got it. It's a paracrine signal. because it's acting on local cells. And here's a little diagram to help you remember how each of these types of signals act. Okay, so we're going to focus in the endocrine system. We're focusing on hormones or endocrine signaling molecules for the most part. But again, keep in mind that some signaling molecules can have multiple modes of action. So they can act both as a paracrine or an autocrine signal and as a hormone. So we can break down hormones into different biochemical classes. We have peptide hormones and steroid hormones are the most important ones. It's the most important distinction. So peptide means that they're protein-based. They're made up of amino acids. And since they're made up of amino acids, since they are proteins, they are hydrophobic, meaning that they can't cross cell membranes. Whereas steroid hormones are, this is what's shown here, they're usually aromatic. That's not how you spell it. And they are lipophilic or hydrophilic, meaning that they can cross cell membranes. So if you know anybody who needs to take estrogen or testosterone, these are steroid hormones, and one of the best ways to deliver them is to put them in a cream and just have the person rub that cream on their skin. And the reason is these steroid hormones can travel directly from your skin into the blood because it can pass through all of the cell membranes in that way. Yes?
I'm kind of confused as to why you said peptides are hydrophobic and steroids are hydrophilic, because I thought hydrophobic molecules were the ones that were able to easily cross the membrane.
So you have to be hydrophilic. Whoa, wait a second. You might be right there. Thank you. Lipophobic is the better word, or, thank you, polar and nonpolar. Yeah, hydrophobic is not a good way of describing that, sorry. Yes, hydrophobic means it doesn't want to be in fat, so it would stay away from the membranes. Yeah. So lipophobic means it stays out of the membranes. It's polar, so it can't easily cross through. And many steroid hormones are actually derivatives of cholesterol. So cholesterol is a really important component of cell membranes, and it's a really important precursor to a lot of our steroid hormones that are necessary for normal homeostasis. Some hormones are monoamines, and these actually can act as neurotransmitters in the nervous system. Things like adrenaline and norepinephrine. Serotonin. So monoamines, this is one amino acid that has been modified. The functional groups on it have been modified. But it can act as a signaling molecule. And then the eicosanoids, we've talked about a little bit when we talked about the prostaglandins. So what I really want to focus on, though, is the difference between peptide and steroid hormones. So here's another question for you guys. How well do you remember cell signaling from your previous courses? What do you think? Anyone want to be the brave soul? Okay, Ron.
The plasma membrane receptor?
Yep. And why did you choose that?
If it's a protein hormone, that means it's not going to be able to cross the phospholipid bilayer, so it would have to be something exposed extracellularly.
Exactly. So remember, a protein can't cross the cell membrane, so it has to bind to something on the outside of the cell, like a plasma membrane receptor. And that receptor transduces the signal into the cell. So protein hormones bind to cell surface receptors. Steroid hormones, they go directly across the membrane into the cytoplasm, and they can even go into the nucleus. And so they bind to their steroid receptors are intracellular receptors. They could either be cytosolic or they can be nuclear receptors. And quite often, they are nuclear receptors, and as soon as the steroid hormone binds it, they will bind to DNA and change transcription, so either turn on or turn off genes. So these are steroid hormones, are frequently DNA binding proteins. These cell surface receptors that are bound by protein hormones, they transduce their signals through second messengers. And you've probably heard of things like cyclic AMP or G protein coupled receptors, those G proteins. So those are intracellular signaling molecules that transduce the signal and tell the cell to change something because there's been a receptor activation. Okay. So here's a cute little diagram to demonstrate that. And this is, again, showing this effect of cell signaling. So when we're talking about hormones, it's really important to understand how their signals interact with the cells. So they can bind with certain specificity. Does everybody know what the term specificity? How specific it is for one protein receptor or one receptor versus another receptor? So for example, the estrogen receptor is very specific for estrogen. Testosterone does not bind to the estrogen receptor. Whereas you have transporters in the blood that could bind to either testosterone or estrogen, so it has low specificity. Affinity is just how strongly a receptor binds to its target. And saturation refers to how much of the target receptor is bound by a signal at any one time. So these are terms that are really important for pharmacology. And for understanding cell signaling. So we probably won't get into too much about that right now, but I wanted to give you a little refresher before we start getting into the different hormones and what they do. So I'm going to skip this question for now. And start talking about endocrine dysfunction. So endocrine dysfunction can occur at many levels. So you could have abnormal synthesis of your hormone. Either you don't make enough or you make too much. And the synthesis of many hormones is under the control of other signals. So quite often, for example, if you're talking about thyroid hormone, the synthesis of thyroid hormone is under the control of thyroid stimulating hormone. So if there's too much thyroid stimulating hormone, it's going to bind to the receptor and start the the production of thyroid hormone, and you're going to get too much synthesis of thyroid hormone, and you'll get hyperthyroidism. There could be something going on between the receptor and the hormone. So you make the right amount of thyroid hormone, but the thyroid receptor is abnormal. Or it's already bound by something else, like an antibody. So there can be interactions between the hormone and the target, or there can be an abnormal target response. So that thyroid hormone, maybe it binds to the receptor correctly, but that second messenger signaling is messed up in the cell. Or maybe the receptor that's there is binding okay, but there's just not enough receptor being expressed. So there's a lot of ways in which hormone signaling can get messed up and cause endocrine disorders. So now we're going to talk about the endocrine pancreas, and we're going to focus on diabetes. One of my other goals in slowing down was to also remember to give you guys a break, and it's 3 o'clock, so let's do our 2-minute break. Hey, Carl.
Happy Tuesday. For some reason, I thought that's a good day until I realized, these classes I'm taking are my Tuesday classes.
Well, I'm glad it's Tuesday and not Monday.
Yes, very true.
But it's only Tuesday.
Yes, the weather is getting better. Although, yeah, Flagstaff kind of demonstrated yesterday I'm still drunk.
Home stretch, you feeling excited?
Extremely.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, must do well. Finish good.
Finish strong, or just finish.
Yeah. No, I'd rather finish strong. Versus like I'm so afraid of like making all a bunch of little mistakes on papers and other things that I don't come up with bite me. It's like no, I'm not gonna let that happen.
It'll be great.
So I'll try not to.
Oh, I forgot to pause this. So that's in contrast to diabetes mellitus, where the urine is sweet, and it's because diabetes mellitus is characterized by hyperglycemia, high blood sugar. But that glucose gets filtered into the urine. Usually your proximal convoluted tubule reabsorbs all of the glucose in your urine. We don't want to lose any glucose. But in hyperglycemia, you overwhelm that glucose reabsorption mechanism. So those glucose transporters are active transporters, and they can only reabsorb so much glucose. So with hyperglycemia, you end up losing a lot of glucose in the urine, causing sweet urine. And that's true for both diabetes, type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus. You guys have heard of type 1 and type 2? Okay, so what do you know about type 1? What was that? I heard some people. Childhood? Yeah. No, what did you say?
I said it's a genetic.
Genetic. I'm glad you said that. So that's what most people have learned about the difference between type 1 and type 2, that type 1 is juvenile diabetes, type 2 is adult onset. Type 1 is genetic, and type 2 is lifestyle, eating too much sugar. But that's actually not totally true. Both type 1 and type 2 are genetic, and now that we have so much childhood obesity, you can get type 2 diabetes in childhood, so there's not that distinction between juvenile onset anymore. So really, the way to distinguish type 1 from type 2 is mechanistically. Type 1 is destruction of the beta cells. So it's insulin deficiency. The beta cells in the pancreas secrete insulin. Most of the time, type 1 diabetes is autoimmune. And so your immune system, your T cells specifically, but also some antibodies, start to recognize proteins on the beta cells and start to kill the beta cells. So you get a lot of apoptosis of beta cells through the autoimmune function. And you've already learned about autoimmune diseases a little bit, so you know that autoimmune diseases are an interaction between the environment and genetics. So there is a genetic predisposition. Type 1 diabetes does run in families, and it has to do with HLA D3 or D4. So most people who have type 1 diabetes end up having HLA D3 or D4, which are specific alleles for the MHC class 2. Remember your major histocompatibility complex that presents to T cells? So there is a genetic predisposition based on that loss of tolerance, self-tolerance. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. So basically what happens is the cells in your body, mostly your fat cells, your muscle cells, and your liver cells, have insulin receptors, but they stop responding to insulin. They downregulate their insulin receptors, probably because of chronic high exposure to insulin. So people who eat a high sugar diet have a lot of secretion of insulin, tend to also be overweight, and we know that we have the release of adipokines and other hormones from fat cells that can stimulate inflammation. So there's a lot of processes that work together to cause insulin receptor downregulation or insulin insensitivity. So in this case, in type 2 diabetes, your beta cells are just fine, at least at the beginning, the pathogenesis, the beginning of type 2 diabetes, your beta cells are fine. They're secreting insulin. In fact, they're secreting a lot of insulin because your body's not responding to insulin. So they have to make more and more of it just to get the body to respond. So it ends up being relative insulin insufficiency. And that's versus type 1, where you have absolute insulin deficiency. As you kill off the beta cells, they just cannot produce insulin. In type 2, you're still producing insulin, your cells just aren't responding as well to insulin. Yes?
Type 2 be reversible if you change?
Yes. So until the end stages, type 2 is reversible. And that's why there's been this push to diagnose prediabetes at the very beginning when people just have a little bit of insulin resistance, and then be able to coach them or treat them on lifestyle changes. There are a few types of drugs that are now being used to try to reverse this early stage of diabetes, of type 2 diabetes. If it progresses for a long period of time, like decades, a decade or so, you do start to get destruction of the beta cells over time. So the beta cells, they just can't keep up. And then as part of metabolic syndrome, remember that inflammation is triggered. So you get inflammation, you get oxidative stress, and eventually the beta cells will start to die due to those factors. So late stage beta cell destruction. But for most people, if you can, when they are first diagnosed with diabetes, if you can help them control diet, lose weight, exercise more, can actually reverse type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes we cannot reverse. Type 2 diabetes also runs in families. And the genetic link to type 2 diabetes is actually stronger than for type 1 diabetes. So it used to be we didn't quite understand. We thought type 2 diabetes was really based on lifestyle. It was in the morbidly obese who just had no control of their diet. We now know that there are a lot of genetic susceptibilities that are related to metabolism and probably related to the microbiome as well. So type 2 diabetes is not just an obesity-related disease. There's a lot of other factors that go into it. But it is part of metabolic syndrome and does tend to track with those other features of metabolic syndrome. Yes?
What was the reason again that you said they start downregulating the insulin receptor?
Most likely it's because they're exposed to insulin. So every time you eat, and we should back up a little bit, insulin is secreted in response to high blood sugar. So every time you eat, whether you're eating candy or if you're eating a slice of bread, that glucose is what's absorbed into the blood. So your digestive enzymes break down even complex starches into simple sugars, and they are absorbed into the blood. And that blood sugar is detected by the beta cells and trigger the beta cells to secrete insulin. And so insulin signals high sugar. And it causes anabolic reactions. So if we look at insulin's effects on the different types of tissues, insulin is secreted in response to blood sugar, and now it's telling other cells in the body, hey, we have a lot of fuel right now. So look at for the fat cells. What insulin does is it binds to the insulin receptor on fat cells, and it signals those cells to upregulate their glucose transporters. It says, start taking up glucose. There's plenty of glucose around. So the fat cells will start to take up glucose. It says, go ahead and use that glucose to start making fat. So lipogenesis, building fat. Because right now we have a lot of glucose, a lot of fuel available, so we need to store it for later. So it signals to the fat to start storing energy. Stop making fat. So one of the other jobs of fat cells is to break down fat and put it back into the blood to be used as fuel when needed. Insulin says we don't need it right now. We have plenty of fuel, so stop making fat. To the muscles. Your muscles are muscles and brain are your primary users of glucose in the body. So same thing, it tells the muscle cells to start taking up glucose. There's lots of glucose around. Start storing that glucose. So muscles can store glucose in the form of glycogen, just like the liver does. So we have lots of glucose right now, start storing it. And you can actually convert some sugar into proteins. So go ahead and start building up proteins and storing that as an extra fuel source. Same thing in the liver. So take up the glucose and store it as glycogen. Start building fat and storing that fat for later. And stop making new sugar. So one of the jobs that the liver can do is to make glucose when there's not enough around. So insulin signals to the liver not to do that right now because there's plenty. So it's really the hormone of the fed state. Glucagon has the opposite effects. So glucagon is stimulated to be released when you haven't eaten for a long period of time. When your blood sugar starts to drop really low, it signals to all of your peripheral tissues, hey, there's not enough fuel, start making fuel. So your muscles start breaking down glycogen and using that as a fuel source. Your muscles will start breaking down amino acids and using that as a fuel source. Your fat will start making new glucose and putting it into the blood as a fuel source. It'll start breaking down fat. And the same thing for your fat tissue. So if you've not eaten for a long time and have low blood glucose, you start breaking down fat and using that as your fuel source. So this was kind of the basis. You guys know about the Atkins diet, right? So no sugar, no carbs at all. And the thought was, if you don't have any sugar, you're going to stimulate glucagon and you're going to use up the fuel sources in your body. And it works really well for weight loss. There's a lot of other long-term effects that aren't quite as good about that diet. But in general, a low-carb diet does help your body lose weight because you're breaking down stored fuel to be used. So now let's go back to the question, which was, I forgot. What was the question?
Why they downregulate the
Right, okay, thank you. So for type 2 diabetes, why do they downregulate the receptor? So it's thought that if in people with type 2 diabetes, it tends to track with people who eat a high-carb diet and have overweight. And so the beta cells, you're actually producing insulin a lot, especially in big spikes. And so that constant exposure to insulin causes the cells to downregulate. It says, well, we don't need to, it's basically like a really loud message that's always there. You start to tune it out. So the cells are downregulating the receptor in response to chronic high exposure to insulin. Now, there is another type of diabetes called gestational diabetes. And it's actually physiologically normal for women to have they have a relative diabetes, relative insulin insensitivity during gestation. Can anybody think why? What's that?
Because they're also feeding you.
Right? They're feeding the baby. And so you actually want high blood sugar during gestation. You don't want the mother to be taking all of the glucose because that blood is shared. You want that glucose to get to the fetus to help it develop. So gestational diabetes is actually quite normal. We diagnose it as gestational diabetes when it goes above and beyond, when it's higher than your normal insulin resistance that happens during pregnancy. And how you define normal gets to be a really tricky question. And so I'm not going to get into it too much, but just know the reason that we pay attention to gestational diabetes, and women are all, in this country, all women are screened for gestational diabetes because it puts the baby at risk of hypoglycemia after birth, and it puts the mother at risk for developing type 2 diabetes down the road. So a person who develops gestational diabetes is at risk of developing type 2 diabetes after pregnancy. But the mechanism is very similar to the mechanism of type 2 diabetes. It's basically insulin resistance in the peripheral tissues. So I've kind of already outlined the pathogenesis of type 1 and type 2 diabetes. What I want you to see on the next two slides is the downstream effects of these things. So what happens when you don't have enough insulin around? Your cells don't get glucose. So if insulin is not being produced, the cells don't know that there's high blood sugar. That sugar stays in your blood and it can't be used by your cells. So you end up wasting, you get muscle wasting here because the muscles break down protein. They're having to use protein as a fuel source because the glucose can't get into the cells. In the adipose tissue, they're constantly secreting free fatty acids. They're breaking down fat and secreting them into the blood. And that can lead to high blood cholesterol, high blood triglycerides, as well as atherosclerosis. So you get atherogenesis, or the development of atherosclerosis. What's most important in type 1 diabetes, the way that most people are diagnosed is they'll get to a point where they have so little insulin that they become acidotic. They go into ketoacidosis. So one thing the liver can do when there's not enough glucose is it starts to produce ketone bodies. The reason is the brain runs on glucose. And if the liver doesn't think there's enough glucose in the blood, it'll start to produce ketones for the brain to use as an alternative fuel source, because the brain can't use proteins or fat the same way that your muscles can do that. So you produce ketones. Ketones are acidic. Ketone bodies travel in the blood, they're acidic, and they cause acidosis. So your blood acid level goes really high. Well, we haven't gotten into respiratory physiology yet, but acid, the way that you get rid of acid in the body is through hyperventilation. So you actually breathe off carbon dioxide, and that's how one of the ways you try to get rid of acid. So you get hyperventilation related to ketoacidosis. And if this ketoacidosis is not treated at the same time, you have hyperglycemia that causes increased urination, water loss through urination, and so you get hypotension. So hyperventilation and low blood pressure together can cause death. So somebody who's ketoacidotic has to be treated right away. What's remarkable is you give them fluid and you give them some potassium, which helps glucose go into their cells, and they come back right away. It's really, really amazing to see. So these are all the downstream effects and why diabetes is so dangerous. Yes?
Can that also cause like kidney stones to form?
Kidney stones, I don't know. Have you heard of a link between?
I just had a friend who had like been getting kidney stones a lot recently, and her doctor said she might have diabetes.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know that link between kidney stones and diabetes, but I wouldn't discount it. It could definitely be there. One thing I do want to point out that's a really important link is there's very good data out there suggesting that exposure to cow's milk early in life increases the risk of type 1 diabetes. So we've linked type 1 diabetes to exposure to various viruses through autoimmunity. But it seems that there's something about cow's milk protein that can also trigger the autoimmune response to pancreatic beta cells. What it is exactly is not well known, but I want you guys to be aware of it because it's really important. Most infant formula is made from cow's milk, and they found that formula feeding increases the risk of type 1 diabetes in genetically susceptible individuals. Now, there's very, very good reasons to formula feed babies, and formula has saved way more babies than it has caused diabetes in. But I think it is important to be aware of this data that's out there. It's something that's not frequently talked about. The media hasn't really picked up on it. I learned about it not in med school. I learned about it by reading the China study, which is, yes?
Is it just cow's milk, or is it like goat's milk as well, soy milk?
Just cow's milk, yeah. Goat's milk seems to be okay. So a lot of babies who are sensitive to cow's milk are switched over to goat's milk. Soy milk, rice milk, almond milk, all of those are different. It's the casein and whey proteins of cow's milk that can actually trigger an inflammatory response. And it can do that in anybody. A lot of people, and there's a growing number of children who are diagnosed with cow's milk allergies. So there's been a lot of research that's starting to go on into what's exactly behind this link. Yes?
My mom's a pediatrician.
Yes.
She's went on campus probably so many times.
Okay, good. So it is being recognized. And I'm sure she's seen a lot of kids with cow's milk allergies because it's becoming more and more frequent. I don't give my kids any cow's milk. They do like cheese and ice cream, though. It's hard to avoid those. All right. I think I see people getting antsy. Okay. Type 2 diabetes. One thing I do want to point out really quick, though, this diagram is from 2006, and it's incomplete. It shows beta cell apoptosis right here, but again, that doesn't happen until end stage. So the first step is actually insulin resistance. And that's really important because that means it's reversible. With insulin resistance, you can reverse it. You haven't destroyed the beta cells yet. It's only late stage where the beta cells, through adipokines and other inflammation, start to become affected in the disease. So here are some of the signs and symptoms. I just want to mention the complications. So diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2, long-standing hyperglycemia it's the number one cause of kidney failure. It's the number one cause of adult blindness because it causes retinopathy. And it's the number one cause of lower extremity amputation because they get infections and gangrene. So it has a lot of really bad outcomes if it's not appropriately treated. And all of these are related to the effects of hyperglycemia on blood vessels. So most of the effects of diabetes, the complications, are related to vascular disease. And remember, in metabolic syndrome, I've talked about the advanced glycation end products. So high glucose causes advanced glycation end products that damage and they activate endothelial cells, making it prothrombotic, making it more prone to atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, and even the little tiny capillaries. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and we'll pick up with pituitary diseases on Thursday.